Could you perhaps discuss the significant announcements you've made recently with respect to Azure and Snowflake and how that may fit into your service roadmap?
Yeah, sure. So one's a product announcement, one of our technologies, which is a Snowflake technology, and one's just a partnership with Microsoft. So for clarity, we work with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Snowflake, Click, as deployment partners and go-to-market partners in a variety of different capacities around the world. I mean, we service about 250 customers around the world, kind of about 600 people. So, we're deeply rooted and embedded with those organizations in terms of how we collaborate and work together alongside other ones like Palantir and DataRobot. The Azure OpenAI announcement is we were selected as one of their kind of pilot partners to deploy enterprise-grade ChatGPT capabilities within some of our customer environments. That was the Blinds to Go example that I used there. So that's a fairly significant announcement for us in terms of how we're able to go to market with them. And to give you some context, that text-based application has resonance across, I would say close to 3/4 of our customer base. So as a massive kind of nod of the cap to us in terms of the work that we're doing there. As it relates to Snowflake, so we have an application that is a graph analytics application that sits within Snowflake's compute environment, which helps customers who are using Snowflake, which is, again, one of the largest cloud and cloud computation service providers of a multi-billion-dollar market cap. And our application and our joint go-to-market with them helps customers that use Snowflake to better understand their customers' data through lookalike modeling, clustering, and then privacy-safe data sharing. So that's a huge addressable market for everything in technology, publishing, retail, consumer packaged goods. Anybody who has customer data is looking and using Snowflake to be able to better analyze and mobilize that data. And our graph analytics technology is very, very new and very, very high value in that instance. And it drives consumption on Snowflake, which is a huge kind of priority for them now that they have this really strong install base. So, we're kind of knee deep with the big tech players in helping us collectively go to market. And they tend to like our customer lists pretty well. So yeah, thanks for the leading question. That was great.
Thanks, Sasha.
Can I chime in? Are we moving to the broader question period?
We are broad in your questions, Stefan. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, there's a question in the chat for Thomas at Cognitivity that I want to just expand on. It was a question about the impact of if you have a coffee or the time of day the test is taken. I've actually used the test. There's a direct-to-consumer test that you can get access to, and I tested it on myself. And obviously, if you use it before and after you have a coffee, you actually get slightly different scores. And I'm even going ahead and say I tested myself after having too many drinks one Friday night. I was hungover and actually was able to measure my impairment the next morning when I was hungover. But I wanted to ask Thomas more about the use case of that level of sensitivity potentially for monitoring patients who are on these, for instance, these Alzheimer's drugs. These are very expensive drugs. They cost, upwards of $25,000 a year US to keep somebody on them. And obviously they want to be monitoring patients to make sure that the drugs are having an impact. Can you just talk about a potential use case there and how your test could be used in a practical way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that the first thing is that the performance of the test, its ability to pick up on small changes in your sort of brain performance is a very important attribute of the test. So, as to answer the question earlier, you can pick up whether you had coffee, you haven't had sleep. It doesn't put you into a different clinical bracket, but you have a different performance score, and people will have their own range which will have, between a certain figures, there'll be certain deviations from it. That'll be your normal signature. And really where we're going with that is by understanding normal cognition, your change into impairment or return to normal functioning is really around changing in your own personal patterns rather than you fitting a larger trend. Now, to address specifically what you asked about in the Alzheimer's drugs thing, it's a very important point and a very good question because, the CMS in the US has basically said, okay, we will pay for these drugs under Medicare and Medicaid as long as you feed back into a registry the effectiveness of these. Okay. Now, nobody's going to be able to go for regular PET scans or MRI type things. So having a sort of very simple, very sensitive, very reliable measure that can be automatically fed back into the registry for these is very important, and that's certainly something that we're working on at the moment. But yeah, look, for monitoring that's what you want. You want to be able to look at trends. You want to be able to see small changes in people's cognitive function over time to tell whether it's working or not. Not just from an individual drug, but for a specialist who has got a patient who's under a course of treatment, rather than bringing them back in as an outpatient into the clinic all the time, which is expensive and time consuming. Leave them at home. They can then do this test at home. If you start looking like you're not where we expect you to be, bring it back in, because the brain is a very, very good general measure of kind of health generally. It's like a leading indicator. It's the first thing that changes. It's the first thing that recovers. So it's a very, very good way for people to have really great feedback on where patients are going without actually seeing them.
Well, I thought I might just jump back in here with a question for Rob Goring. In your screening, you identified the risk of chat GPT bolt-ons where there's the risk of replication. With a number of companies, we see partnerships formed with Microsoft, Google, etc. Where we see a partnership, is it a natural assumption that the risk of replication is thereby reduced, i.e. these companies only form partnerships where they see IP?
I think great. It's a very good question. I think generally speaking, yes. To get a proper formal partnership, you have to go through a process and be vetted. Also, I think some of the awesome examples today all refer, broadly speaking, to be able to use the existing chat GPT or underlying GPT for a large language model, and then applying that to typically private corporate data or other private data sets. And that kind of solves the problem of uploading all this private data into a public cloud and having it accessible. So I think that's a phenomenal use of the power of a chat GPT or a GPT-4 backend, is taking it, leveraging all the great work OpenAI has done to make that model valuable, and then siloing your data and making it private, contained, secure, and now being able to do things with it. That's a great enterprise or vertical application, and generally never one that will be replicated by an OpenAI.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I sort of wanted to ask a question of Sasha at Now Vertical. And it's more around the mindset of the enterprises that you deal with and how quickly they're adopting here. Because I think there's sort of a sense out there that everybody's just diving into this new world. And, I think enterprises tend to be very, very risk adverse. How quickly are they adopting? And could there be possibly disappointments as to the speed they move at? Because I think you see a pretty good broad section of enterprises in your client base.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the sensitivity to the publicly trained data sets or applications that you see in the kind of pop culture media currently, I think is an area of, there's a level of scrutiny that organizations that are doing their own data science or machine learning work kind of see when they look at some of these publicly trained applications. And there's reams of examples in terms of the difference between public data training sets and then like actual private training sets. So the good news is that most of the organizations and enterprise and governments that at least we work with have a level of maturity around the kind of foundational requirements of doing any type of AI in industry and government, which is around big data, data science, data engineering. So there's a level of sophistication that already exists, especially in the Fortune 1000s and the large governments or the large kind of, I don't know, call it top 20 economies in the world. So there's an appetite for it, but you have to address, and this is the four big things that we focus on addressing, which is the data, right? So you have to be able to train these models or deploy these models on the right data sets. And most organizations struggle with understanding that. So we help them with that around data discovery, technology, and solutioning. There's talent gaps. So many organizations, IT, people in IT, data science, they're very few in an organization. They're largely kind of oversubscribed, overutilized. So you have to solve for that. The risk piece is enormous. So the risk around not only just like GDPR style or HIPAA style kind of legislation is one form of risk, but the other risk is if you don't understand what's going into your models, you run risks of building models or artificial intelligence that is artificially wrong. And you don't want necessarily machines to be trained on the wrong information and therefore build the wrong models. And there's very little tolerance for black box applications in enterprise and government. So you have to be able to interpret the model. And then you have to target returns. So if you're able to help to address that and orchestrate things, appetite is huge, right? But it has to be against use cases that are valuable, which is why we focus so much on things like, churn analysis for, key customers. They'll pay for that stuff all day long, and they'll do it in a recurring way. But you have to demonstrate that you're able to deploy these systems and these solutions, because this is just a natural evolution of all the investments that they've made around IT, big data, and the engineering systems that they have in place. So it's a well-defined and relatively mature market, believe it or not. The GPT functions in the public kind of sphere, I think, are slightly misleading in terms of how companies and governments use artificial intelligence. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, that's great.
If I could add to that, I've got a couple points that Sasha just touched on, I think, that are very, very valid. I think for us, we've seen great success at a government level now internationally in a lot of our enterprise clients, because you can't just show up and we're a new AI company. You have to have your ISO, you have to be GDPR compliant, your SOC 2. So there's a lot of certification that goes along with this. To Sasha's point, these organizations are incredibly up to speed as to what's out there. There is a tremendous appetite for it. It's finding the right partners that de-risk their opportunities, to your point, Christine. And I think the biggest one here, and the most important one, it's always about value realization. At the end of the day, we're going to make significant investment into this. What do we expect to get out of it? That's the great one now that I'm starting to hear, is that we're moving forward because we identify value realization. Here's what this means to our organization. I think that's the biggest thing. I think when I hear and see a lot of these presentations today, they've got all tremendous value and use case application into the world at a global level, not just here, of course, at home in North America. So it's very exciting to see some of the opportunities that have been put together here today. So thank you.
Okay, if I ask to Thomas, can you please talk about what are the unique regulatory challenges that using artificial intelligence in a healthcare setting entails?
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting area because it's kind of new. And I think from our point of view, what we see is actually a kind of a lack of joined up thinking between different regulatory agencies. And one of the things they seem to struggle with is the idea that it is not a kind of one size fits all approach. So, it's really very sensitive to what you're using it for, the kind of claims you're making, what the end, the outcome of the use of it will be. So we find that when we go to different regulatory agencies, we have to kind of, work with the different set of, shall we say, criteria that they go to. Now, I would say that actually, I don't know that it's just us, but the FDA in the US are actually quite good relatively for this. They are, listening to people. They're trying to get their head around it and to make this happen. The way that we go around it is really before we do any submission, actually much earlier in the process, that we go ahead, we contact the agencies and say, okay, this is what we're planning to do. This will be the design of our studies. These are the way that we're going to use the data. Is this going to be acceptable to you? Please make any comments at this stage. And that's exactly what we did with the FDA, and that worked very, very well, actually. And they are certainly up for those discussions. But yeah, I think that the big challenge is really around the agencies understanding the kind of relative use of each one, the relative importance of the information that comes, and being somewhat consistent about it.
If I could jump in with a question for Peter, I think Peter Evans is still around with us. If you could talk to the competitive landscape, what you're seeing, given this massive opportunity to get more advanced technologies into stadiums, like who are you kind of going up against, and maybe talk about how your tech is differentiated from what you see out there.
Yeah, so Mike, thank you for the question. I much appreciate it. And from were asked it online if somebody did. There's really sort of, I think, 4 or 5 different approaches. One approach is do nothing. And we often see this with customers because it's always hard to put a quantification around security sometimes. A casino general manager says, we've got to do this. And the CFO says, let's go put the money into 4 more slot machines. So you always see a little bit of that situation. Then you've got old traditional walk-through metal detectors and wands that we all have seen and experienced before. And there's some people who continue to buy those. Although the patron experience is getting worse and worse and worse, and people are kind of, I think, passively rebelling against that. In terms of direct competition for what we do, everyone, if you talk to the chief security officer of the NBA, a gentleman named Leon Newsom, he and I talk weekly. He'd say everyone talks about the big 3, us being one of those big 3. There's a solution in the marketplace which is from one of the walk-through metal detector companies. And essentially they saw us and they said, we're going to be obsoleted unless we do something. So like all walk-through metal detectors we've all experienced, they just turn down the sensitivity. It's like turning down the volume. So it's not going to alert on a cell phone, but it's also not going to alert on knives and small guns and large guns even. So it's got a little bit of security theater, but it's cheap. So if you want just a cheap solution, you want the Big Mac of security, you'd go with them. Okay. It's kind of like a Big Mac. Is it really food? It's kind of like asking a question. Is it really security in this day and age? I don't think anybody wants the liability associated with putting in the cheap solution and then something negative happens, because the due diligence and the discovery will show that you knowingly bought a suboptimal solution that put your patrons at risk. On the other end of the spectrum, there's one competitor who's been around for 10 odd years. They've probably got the largest incumbency out there. Very, very expensive, very, very heavy. I equate it to being the BlackBerry, this first smartphone that was out there. So they created a market. We all had a smartphone. We all had a BlackBerry, but it kind of sort of worked, but not great, but it was very expensive. Our big advantage versus both those customers is what we've done with what we've been talking about on this call, AI and our software platform. We built a true software platform that's purpose-built to do this, that's got extensibility to it. So today's problem and what people are writing checks for is for weapons detection. Nobody wants guns in schools. Nobody wants guns in arenas. And we solve that problem uniquely, inexpensively, and incredibly effectively. As I said, we're the only company that's been verified by the TSA to provide that highest degree of security. But the software platforms allows us to do so many more things, right? We can integrate into it ticketing. We can integrate into it facial recognition for banned patron identification. We can integrate into all sorts of things. Retailers have come to us and said, can you alert on weapons on the way in and alert on stolen goods on the way out? So the extensibility to address problems of the future and layer more and more and more software, SaaS software models stacked on top of the incumbency is our biggest differentiator, and particularly from an investor point of view. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
And maybe one last question, sort of more broad question, and this might be good to start with Rob Goring on this. Like, what scares you the most out there? What from an investor point of view, where do you see the most risk and the most concern?
No, it's a great question. I think from an investor point of view, and I think a lot of folks have mentioned this today, is just they're like in these markets, everyone piles in and creates a lot of noise in the market. And I think that we've seen that in the capital markets, we saw that. You see that with the crypto and marijuana before that, all these kind of things. So I think in capital markets, we always run the risk of there being a lot of Me Too players and people that kind of jump in and create a lot of noise and kind of take the quality capital and disperse it a bit. So I think really this is a hugely beneficial reason to have a program like this today, where we can start to actually have these deeper discussions around AI and business models and real companies building real things. I think that's the scariest thing. From a technology standpoint, for again, capital markets, public market investors, again, I'd be, the long-term time horizon investments that they're going to take 5 to 10 years to materialize. Those are just a challenge, to be totally honest. I think those are difficult, and the world is capitalized with, again, certain venture investors and private equity companies that are structured to take these very long-term views. I think, again, from an applied AI standpoint, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. I would echo a lot of what Sasha said earlier around the talent gap and the lack of people. And what I see in, again, a lot of work I do with the BC Tech Association, all these companies we kind of interact with, is we are seeing enterprises, governments, everyone asking about AI and adopting it. So the more that we can find these applied vertical and kind of enterprise solutions, I think those are the better choices for investors.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think, Rob, that's a really, really good point, particularly your first point. I spent a little bit of time in the marketing world, and the number one thing for marketing guys is to drive as much traffic to your website as you can. So you grab what's hot. In the cybersecurity world, where 1 year was exfiltration, the next year was data leakage prevention, the next year it was whatever. And the marketing guys glom on to whatever that hot word is, and they sprinkle it all over all their marketing materials. And it creates unnecessary confusion in the industry. What is an AI-driven solution? What isn't? What is simply pattern matching? And I think it does a bit of a disservice to the industry. It's a really good point you make.
I just want to draw some attention to William had a great question in the chat, and it was surrounding the Monk debates on AI and is it an existential threat to humanity? My personal perspective, and coming out of the quantum computing and like advanced hardware and software space for the past 2.5 years before joining now, I'm very much in alignment with Jan LeCun, and I think that the AI solutions and systems that we have here today are very narrow and don't have anywhere near the aptitude of human intelligence, let alone cat intelligence. And I think trying to stop or slow down the work in this space is nonsensical. I think that if you think about really simple applications like teaching somebody to drive a car, I think it's something like teenagers, the odd time, I think about 20 hours of drive time until they realize it. And in spite of the hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of hours that we have with self-driving cars, I mean, the brittleness of the models as it relates to those types of applications are really, they're really apparent, and we have so much ground to make up before we get to anything that's going to be kind of existentially a problem. Misinformation, we've got more issues with social media and misinformation than we do with AI. So, and there's solutions for that. So I think that a lot of this stuff, my personal perspective, is just, I think it's a little bit just trying to get attention for the wrong reason. So I actually don't think we have an existential threat with regards to AI, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick. I would tend to agree. I mean, for those who don't know Yann LeCun, he's the head of AI at Meta, Facebook. So in terms of looking at mass amounts of social data, that's a very interesting position for him to take. I think it is important, and I know a lot of us on this meeting, ethical AI is an important thing. Explainable AI has been talked about a lot today. We joined a program called Cascade AI, which is sort of a Pacific Northwest approach to making sure that the ethical use of data. I was on a panel in January with the Vancouver Information Privacy Society about a lot of these topics, and there's absolutely concerns. You look at companies like Clearview AI that did a lot of the facial recognition technology for law enforcement. Their utilization of people's faces without you getting permission. We've seen lots of examples of that, but generally speaking, I think we're getting a lot more net benefit out of the AI tools. There's always the horrible use cases out there. Again, I think Warren Buffett made the quote about, like nuclear power is amazing for the world. It could kill everyone, but it doesn't. It's all about how we use it. And I've seen the vast majority of companies using these technologies very appropriately. There will be guidelines and guide rails in place. But also I think the other argument that was made is that, talk about a moratorium on North America stopping. Well, what if we stopped and everyone else in the world didn't? There's a concept in AI of cumulative or accumulated advantage, where the snowball rolls down the hill and gets bigger and bigger. If you stop for a while, the other snowballs keep going. So there's an important element for us to be able to stay on top of these technologies as well, but also maintain the societal and ethical impacts of it for sure.
That was great, and that's probably a great high point to sort of tie up the conversation. I know we've gone a little bit over our time here, but again, I just, on behalf of Rob Goff and then the rest of the team here, I just really like to thank all of you for joining us today and presenting your companies and your ideas. Again, if anybody wants further information on any of these companies, please reach out to myself or Rob Goff, and we're happy to set up one-on-ones or direct meetings and provide further information. One last thing I would like to say is there are 5 publicly traded companies here. We all think they look very, very interesting. Rob Goring was kind enough to join us today as to sort of share his expertise on the space as a whole. But he's also bringing public a very interesting little company in the cybersecurity space, Wiser AI. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about it today because it is not public yet, but if anybody wants further information there, very, very happy to provide it. And I think just a really interesting company in itself that we're working on bringing public soon. But on that note, yeah, again, thanks everyone for joining us, and hopefully you found it useful.